Okay, first of all, I want to thank Santiago Miret and Maria Laura Alvarez for the organization of this symposium and for giving me the opportunity to present Matias today. As you all know already, this activity is part of the Materialness, Material Architecture Symposium of the Maestría en Investigación Proyectual from Poiesis Center. So welcome to the day, to the second day of the symposium. Last Monday, we had the opportunity to see the work of Federico Garrido. Today, we will be counting with the presence of Matias del Campo. Next Monday, we will have a conference with Antoine Picon. And on Thursday, I will be presenting a brief workshop on ornament and AI. Today's conference is extremely relevant in the current context in which architecture is developing. Personally, I believe that the development of artificial intelligence is paving the way to a new way of embracing the discipline. Perhaps not as cheerful as we imagine, not as controllable as we hope, but to make an AI in architecture a reality, we have yet a long way to go. Luckily, there are architects like Matias that take the chance and, against all odds, open new possibilities every day to approach this new paradigm in a disciplinary and serious way. The current state of architecture in relation to AI may become inscrutable in several aspects, but it is this current scenario regarding post-human conditions in a digital context that remains relevant still. Matias' work focuses on the nature of a design ecology in which human ingenuity meets artificial intelligence. What changed through this novel relationship in the design process? It is more of an extended intelligence, or does AI create really novel architectural solutions? New in relation to what standards? Let's keep in mind that new does not always mean good or relevant. The conference examines aspects of sensitivity, the ability of artists and designers to invent genuinely new ideas in terms of form, content, and materialization, and compares them with solutions found by neural networks and other artificial intelligence applications. Art and architecture positions are exposed and compared to demonstrate cross-pollination between both practices generated by AI. The result is an attempt to critically interrogate the ontological framework belonging to the material and the symbolic cultures that emerge from architectural design assisted by artificial intelligence. So let me introduce today's guest. Matias del Campo is an architect, Master of Architecture from the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, and Doctor of Architecture from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. He is an Associate Professor at the University of Michigan's Taubman's College of Architecture and Urban Planning. His obsessive explorations in contemporary modalities, fed by a wide repertoire of materializations of natural protocols, cutting-edge technologies, and philosophical searches, make up his coherent project, Ecology. He has recently been awarded to Accelerate CERN Fellowship. He's part of the board of directors in Acadia and has been guest editor of the architectural magazine, Architectural Design. In 2003, together with Sandra Manninger, they founded Span Architecture Office, which has gained wide recognition with their winning proposal for the Austrian Pavilion at the 2010 Shanghai World Expo, as well as the new Brancusi Museum in Paris. Span's work has been exhibited at the 2012 Venice Biennale, at Archilab in Orleans, France, at the Beijing Architecture Biennale 2008 and 2010, in the formation exhibition at the Museum of Applied Arts MAG in Vienna in 2011, and the Fab Union Gallery in Shanghai 2017. Their most recent book, Sublime Bodies, Township Press Shanghai, was published in 2017. Okay, Matias, once again, thank you very much. Pleasure to have you here.
Federico, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Primero de nada, tengo que disculparme que no puedo hacer la lecture en español porque mi español no es suficiente para hacer una buena charla sobre arquitectura. So I'm really sorry for that.
Don't worry.
Maybe with more training, I could do it in Spanish, but all right. Anyways, I have to thank Santiago Miret and of course Laura Alvarez for making this possible today for me to be here and talk to you guys, and Federico for the fantastic introduction and hopefully great conversation afterwards. Federico already mentioned a lot of very interesting aspects, and I hope I can cover with the lecture that I'm holding today, entitled Matter Ex Machina. Yeah. Let me just quickly see my presentation here. All right, do you see my slides? Yes?
We're seeing it. Very good.
Okay, great. Okay, so my name is Dr. Matias del Campo. As Federico mentioned, I'm a co-founder of SPAN together with Sandra Manninger, and we operate from Vienna, Shanghai, and recently also from Detroit. So the lecture is called Matter Ex Machina, which is basically an attempt of an ontological interrogation of architecture and artificial intelligence. I hope I can clarify some points today in regards of our position towards artificial intelligence and architectural design. And I would like to start with the statement that Sandra and I both believe that this is the first genuinely 21st century design technique, especially when it comes to computational design. Because if you think about it, all of the design techniques that we have been working with in the last 20 years were already invented in the 20th century, but just refined over time in the last 20 years. So it is, better in parametricism, better in polygon modeling, better in NURBS modeling, but all of this was already done before. Agent-based modeling was also done in the 20th century. But artificial intelligence in architecture is possible through technical developments that happened in the last 5 years. And I will talk a little bit more about this throughout the lecture. But first, I would like to explain a little bit about my own origins and the origins of my obsessions with technology. So I will let you in a little bit of a secret here. If I would not have become an architect, I most likely would have become an archaeologist, and more precisely an Egyptologist. Yeah. But this is actually something that describes me a little bit why we are so obsessively looking also into the past, while at the same time looking into the future. And this obsession with technology is something that has been around in architecture in Vienna very specifically. Yeah, so I've been described as a member of the lineage of Viennese architects obsessed with technology. However, this is not an obsession of technology as a tool of expediency, but rather the interest is in the interrogation of the tool as an agent of culture. So architects like Walter Bichler, Hausrucker Co., Koppel-Möblau, Hans Hollein, and so on, they were all obsessed with this sort of idea of how actually technology makes an imprint in culture. And I have to say that also most of these architects were my teachers. That is exactly what I try to encapsulate with the projects I do together with my team. The interrogation of contemporary culture informed by a combination of advanced technology, theory, and philosophy. So if I would have to describe my project, I would say that my project reflects on the possibility that architectural form and content can emerge outside an anthropocentric universe through emergent design methodologies. In doing so, the work yields new discursive and cultural readings, an issue that I have described as architecture in the post-human age. The main method that I explore currently to achieve this is the use of artificial intelligence for designing and planning in architecture. With this in mind, our primary interest resides in novel possibilities in negotiating the architectural object within a manifold of conditional possibilities in gravitational fields of influence, such as architectonic archetypes, columns, compartments, apertures. Aspects of alternative contextualizations, such as social, political, or economic, and contemporary methods of materialization, such as automated or ecological. What best summarizes my efforts to describe my project is my PhD, Autonomous Tectonics, which I defended at the Melbourne Institute of Architecture, of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. In contrast to the examples that exercise full control in a top-down design process, Autonomous Tectonics speculates on the aspects of a non-anthropocentric design environment where the architect as the sole genius of a design is perceived as a suspicious figure, and ideas of full automation in design are embraced as an alternative creative environment. This alternative method of design opens opportunities to discuss aspects of a post-digital world, of the impact of automation to society, economy, and culture, as well as providing alternative morphologies, typologies, and organizations of space. A novel cultural entity that discusses moments of estrangement and seeks a conversation on the aspects of architecture that possesses disciplinary autonomy. At the same time, it is embedded in the currents of a changing culture of production, in which autonomous tectonics are at play. This novel cultural consideration is shared with a series of colleagues and peers who work on related conditions and problems. So the dissertation that I made was basically an attempt to discuss the evolution of the work of SPAN through the lens of discursive inquiry and cultural agency, resulting in the concept of autonomous tectonics. So it can be described as a forensic examination of the work of my practice SPAN. The text interrogates how design research serves as a main tool for the development of novel trajectories in the practice. This is exemplified by the description of two main design approaches through a series of projects. The top-down design technique of topological modeling and its application in a series of design projects, and the subsequent transformation into a primarily bottom-up technique through the use of recursive algorithms, artificial intelligence, and the exploration of emergent fabrication methods. The text examines how design research went full circle and how the basic design technique of curvilinear continuous spaces consisting of smooth single surfaces was abandoned in favor of a high-resolution, intricate object condition with a clear tendency towards granular and coarse assemblies that embrace the main architectural problems of joints, mullions, doors, arches, columns, fenestrations, and corner problems. All of this is accompanied by the critical interrogation of the ontological and epistemological framework emerging from the becoming of these objects. Philosophy, in this frame of thinking, serves as a source of inspiration and forms the base for the creation of a language to describe the project's inherent qualities. As Ludwig Wittgenstein famously said, and I quote, "What you cannot talk about, you have to remain silent about," end of quote. For me, this was never a proposition to remain silent, but a challenge to develop and even invent a language to describe and talk about my projects. Within this line of thoughts is also my book, Sublime Bodies, that collects various essays on aspects such as automation, post-digital trajectories, down to the problems of construction, such as the inclusion of detail in topological surfaces. Every chapter starts with the interrogation of a cultural or historic artifact and its relationship to one particular project of my practice. As a natural continuation of these efforts, and within that clear lineage of publications, is my edition of AD, Evoking Through Design. This AD collects various positions on the topic of mood and atmosphere in contemporary design. In the words of Helen Castle, chief editor of AD at the time, and I quote, "There is an elemental conviction that great architecture must move us. It should trigger an emotional response. The drawing in of breath on entering a Gothic cathedral. But how is it possible to create highly contemporary architectural spaces that are infused with atmosphere, ambience, and mood?" Evoking Through Design highlights how up-to-date architectural technologies and techniques can be combined with traditional knowledge and design skills to enhance the sensorial qualities of space. Moods range from the light-hearted, the colorful, playful, and happy, to the painterly, the nebulous, the drama of chiaroscuro, light and shade, the gloomy and the cavernous. End of quote. In order to illustrate this notion, I would like to present two projects from the practice. So what you see here is basically a collage of a selection of projects from the last years. They range from jewelry design to urban interventions. And I would first like to show you the Austrian Pavilion for the Shanghai Expo in 2010 as one extreme of the trajectory of design. So this project can be described as a transitional project. It marks a turn in the trajectory of the practice. It marks the moment we change from a distinct top-down topological geometry approach to an emergent bottom-up design technique. In this sense, this project was a hybrid. The morphology of the pavilion was developed using an automated evolutionary approach. Hundreds of iterations approximated the final shape of the project that ultimately was designed to seamlessly connect exterior with interior and to create a continuous circulation within the pavilion. The pavilion was visited by more than 7 million visitors. The expo was open for 6 months, so that's more than 1 million visitors per month. The facade was one of the first, if not the first one, to be developed in Grasshopper. The design of the facade started when it was not even called Grasshopper, but explicit history. Our practice was in the lucky situation that we were also commissioned to design the entire interior, including furniture, graphic design, exhibition design, and the content of the interactive exhibition. This, of course, positions this project close to the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, something that Hans Hollein and I discussed on many occasions in his office. The all-encompassing piece of art, where the architect is in full control of the final result and thus can profoundly influence the atmospheric effects of the project. Again, a very Austrian thing to do. Just think of the Palais Stocklet or any other interior designed and outfitted by the Wiener Werkstätte. And finally, we got visit from Arnold Schwarzenegger himself, who came over to have a little bit of Apfelstrudel in the restaurant of the Expo Pavilion. The second project I would like to show is in line of Expo projects, actually, is the Austrian Pavilion for the 2020 Dubai Expo, which you probably all heard was postponed to next year. And this was our competition entry for that pavilion. We came really, really close to winning this, by the way. I think, well, too bad we didn't win it. I would have loved to build this. But the reason I'm showing you this particular project is because this was our first successful AI-driven project. Sander and I first got in touch with the topic of artificial intelligence in Vienna in 1997, when we were introduced to the basic research conducted at the OFI, the Austrian Institute for Artificial Intelligence. In 2007, we held the first course in machine learning at the Angewandte in Vienna, again in collaboration with the OFI. The ceiling of this project is a 2D to 3D style transfer, acting between Baroque sensibilities as a style and a series of modern ceilings as the target. The result is this strangely articulated ceiling that oozes Baroque presence. The floor is intentionally kept modern and simple in order to create a space full in tension between modern and Baroque sensibilities. It is even more visible in this rendering of the café of the pavilion. The vertical openness of this space again allows for the tension between floor and ceiling, accentuated in this case with a floor that takes cues from the patterns of the Wiener Werkstätte. We slipped a little joke for us in this space in that we used the chairs out of Lowe's design for the Café Museum. They are still in production today. The goal was to desecrate the architectural tradition that Lowe's has created. The main concept of the pavilion was to represent the country not by highlighting products such as tractors, lifts, car parts, and wine, the usual expo modus, but rather to represent Austria through culture. What you see here in the foreground, in this glass cube, is the Venus from Willendorf in the foreground. It's a tiny 30,000-year-old Paleolithic sculpture. This sculpture shares a field of tension with Maria Lasnik's small science fiction self-portrait that you see on the wall. Immediately, the dialogue between these two pieces of art evoke aspects such as emancipation, equality, feminist conversations. The entire exhibition was designed as a dialogue between ancient and modern art. In addition to this, the pieces of art also served as a trigger for an augmented reality application, which was an overlay with additional levels of information. This allows the Austrian industry to connect to the arts in a more mundane modus of the show. We tested the idea in the Belvedere in Vienna, where we used an Egon Schiele painting as a trigger image for discussions on forests, ecology, and methods of forestation. So in the pavilion, we envisioned a variety of pieces of art on display that would discuss a variety of different topics. So for example, we also would have displayed Erwin Worm's Fat Car in the exhibition. There we are, that's the Fat Car, which would have contained additional information in the AR layer about the car industry and responsibility for ecological considerations. We kept experimenting with this idea also in this exhibition, which we did for the MAC in Los Angeles, where we created this background trigger image you see here and a series of virtual columns in the foreground, which you were able to explore using an augmented reality application that you could download. Okay, so you saw like basically that's the sort of universe of ideas and things we've been working on for a long time now, but let's discuss about the contemporary position of culture in regards of artificial intelligence and the post-human universe. Just to clarify, when I speak about post-human, I don't mean a world after humans. It's not a world without humans. It just means that it is a time after the dominance of the human species over the world. If we think about artificial intelligence, we have to start to understand that we are not at the pinnacle of a pyramid of creation in terms of arts or any other things or inventions in the world, but we're starting to share that. So it becomes a plateau where artificial intelligence and humans are sharing agency, authorship, and so on. And that's what I describe as the post-human universe. Yeah. Within that, the arts are always a good indicator for that sort of shifts and changes. This person here is Mario Kingemann, a German artist, who's an avid user of generative adversarial networks in his work. And what he does is he creates databases of historic paintings to create new content, which is in a way, but it's not a copy of the old. It's not an imitation of the old. Rather, through the interpretation, through the generative adversarial network, it becomes a moment of estrangement, of defamiliarization, of so-called weird realism. And I would describe this also with within the frame of thinking of Graham Harman. I have to add to this, I'm not the biggest fan of Graham Harman, but there are certain aspects that I'm interested in. And especially when he talks about defamiliarization, estrangement, ruination, weird realism, these are things I'm interested in. He wrote this book called Lovecraft and Philosophy, Weird Realism, which I can really recommend in that extent, how the arts, like for example, these pieces of art here from an artist called Oscar Martinez, you can, I mean, if you're culturally educated, you will see that the images on the right, for example, have a relationship to paintings from the Renaissance era to the Baroque era, I would say. So there is this moment of defamiliarization. You recognize things, but they're not the same thing. They're not like what you know already. And I think this is an interesting provocation, artistically, philosophically, intellectually, that we can, as architects, pick up and work with. Just think about the thousands of years of plans that we as a discipline have accumulated, and the possibility to sift through those plans to generate new content or new ideas about space, new ideas about materialization, new ideas about mass and void, for example. The most famous example in that area probably is the portrait of Edmond de Bellamy by the Paris-based art collective Obvious, which sold at Christie's for $432,320, I think about 2 years ago. This was similarly created to the technique I described with the work of Mario Kingemann, in that a database of thousands of historic portraits from the 15th century to the 19th century was used as the database for a generative adversarial network to generate this image. Now, here comes a very specific question into place. If you think about the process that was applied here, who is the author? Are the artists the authors of this painting? Are the programmers who actually created the code for the generative adversarial network the author? Is it the neural network? Or is it the painters of the thousands of paintings that were used to generate this image as a database? So there is like a lot of things here that are questioned, and there's no clear answer to that at the moment. And also it's about the position that you take in terms of artistic history towards this painting. Let's assume we take Duchamp's position on this, that the artists basically found the algorithm, and thus the artists are, of course, the artists, because they actually just found an object and created a piece of art out of it. But I think that it's much more complex than that because of the content of what is done here. In any case, I think this is an interesting side note here, that the title of the painting, Edmond de Bellamy, could actually hint towards the inventor of the generative adversarial network, who's called Ein Goodfellow. So if you translate Bellamy from French to English, it's something like good fellow, yeah, or good friend. So maybe they're talking here about Ian Goodfellow. And again, the generative adversarial network was just invented 2015. So you see how it's a rather recent discovery that is really exploding at the moment in the creative arts. So how can architecture be part of this conversation? Yeah. How can the architecture discipline engage in a conversation about automation in our contemporary world? In the last decade, the conversation on automation and robots in architecture has been primarily dominated by a discussion about the capabilities of the tool to facilitate procedures or to create novel formal vocabularies. Conferences on robots and automation in architecture profoundly focus on the technological achievements and the many variations of material formations that can be accomplished using a robotic setup, from stacking exotic figurations of bricks to fiber winding panels inspired by biological phenomena, to the meticulous and precise forming of metal sheets with robots. The research essentially focuses on the technological agencies. This predominantly technical conversation just rarely touched on the larger issues at hand as to how automation might change aspects of cultural, social, and political discourse in the architectural discipline. Of course, there's a longer history to the application of artificial intelligence in architecture, partially also illustrated by Maury Wright Steenson's book, Architectural Intelligence, laying out 4 positions of architects between the 1960s and the early 80s. And these 4 examples are Christopher Alexander, Richard Saul Wurman, Cedric Price, and Nicolas Negroponte, which also shows one of the major problems we are facing within this kind of research. It's primarily white and primarily male. Yeah, and that is something that we need to change. There is also, of course, the dark side of AI that I don't want to omit here. Let me give you one example about, let me say, a suspicious way of using neural networks, or something that we should really worry about. In 2016, ProPublica published an article by Julia Angwin, Jeff Larson, Suya Matu, and Lauren Kirchner, who basically described how a neural network that is used for parole cases has a racial bias. I will briefly explain what parole case is. A parole case is basically when somebody who's in jail is given the chance to come free earlier than his sentence is asking for, due to the way how he behaved in jail, and also due to the convincing case that he can be a valuable member of society again. Now, in order to help in those cases, the Department of Justice in the United States created a neural network that analyzes parole cases and makes suggestions whether to give the person parole or to keep him in jail. Now, this neural network primarily gave parole to white people and did not give parole to people of color. And the analysis of these authors of the ProPublica article found out that this neural network is racially biased. And that happened because of the database that was used to train the neural network. One scientist was sitting down, labeling each case in the neural network and creating, of course, the weights also for this neural network. And because of the way how he trained that neural network, the neural network became racist. And the most interesting part for me in that story was that the scientist who was in charge of doing that labeling task did not identify as racist. He was actually surprised when people were telling him that his neural network is racist. So what the story about that is, you can even introduce racial bias unintentionally. And I think one of the things that needs to be done in order to reduce the risk, for example, for racial bias in AI, is that people from different cultural backgrounds need to train the neural networks. Not only one person, not only 2 persons, but dozens of people with a variety of cultural and racial backgrounds. That would make it hopefully a little bit more objective. In this area of thinking, I can highly recommend James Bridle's New Dark Age. in order to read deeper into that sort of problems that come along with the use of AI. So in order to be a critical thinker within this newly emerging discipline of AI and architecture, you have to know the good part, but you also need to know the bad part. That's what I try also to teach to my students. Once they have both parts in place, you can be really you can critically interrogate the problem, not only superficially, but in a deep extent. I will go a little bit faster over these more technical parts here about what is artificial intelligence. Just quickly, there's a short definition that 3 specific aspects have to be in play: intentionality, intelligence, and adaptability. All of which I could talk for half an hour each, but I'm gonna keep it short and go ahead and ask, why use an AI? Which I think is an important question. Why should we use an AI? Now, the simple answer would be, it's better to teach machines how to learn instead of how to do things. What is meant by that? Consider, for example, the production line of cars. So you have this line of production where you have these cars coming along, and robots have been used in the car fabrication industry for more than 50 years now. Until very recently, you had to train a robot manually where, for example, are the welding points that you need to weld this car together. And every time a new car was produced, those welding points had to be taught again manually to this robot, which is very time-consuming and very expensive at the end of the day. So using artificial intelligence, you can go ahead and instead of training a robot point by point where to weld, you create a neural network with a database of millions of welding points that have been done throughout the last 30 years, let's say. Once you have trained the neural network properly and you have this neural network in place, the robot will have learned where the optimal welding points of a car are for many, many different models. And then using machine vision, you can send along any car and he will know, because he learned it, where good welding points are for that car, which means every single car can be different, which would have been impossible with manual teaching. So that is one example, just to visualize it. There are 2 specific trajectories of applications and research in AI at the moment. One is generalized AI and one is applied AI. Generalized AI would be an AI that can do a lot of different things at the same time. Think of all these robots that you see in science fiction. Those are all generalized AIs. And we are probably a little bit far away from making that a reality because it's really, really complex to do that. An applied AI, on the other hand, is an AI that only does one thing, but that one thing it does really well. Just think of where, for example, when you're writing checks in the bank, yeah? I can tell you no real person looks at that check and that numbers anymore. It all gets scanned, and the neural network that is trained to understand numbers will then figure out which numbers are written on the check and translate that into machine language so that it can be processed. Another aspect which I think is super interesting in our conversation is the post-human perception of the world. I just mentioned briefly machine vision with the robots building the cars, right? Machine vision is also used a lot, for example, in all those self-driving cars so that they can recognize their environment. It's based on LiDAR, for example, which is light detection and ranging, a method to estimate the distance of objects. But that's not all. It needs to understand what is what, and for that it uses a variety of different neural networks. Yeah? So what I consider interesting in this case is that because there is now a player that has a different way to see the world, we can expand our ideas of what the world is within our universal thinking as humans. Another aspect of this would be, is it necessary that we understand that at all? Like, is it really necessary? And that's a really important question. But let's go into AI and creativity. Can AIs be creative? Yeah. Hot debate, very, very hot debate at the moment. Let me give you 2 possible examples. This is the so-called Bob and Dallas experiment by Facebook Artificial Research Unit that they made in 2017. The idea here was they wanted to create an AI that can actually talk to a customer on the phone about banking issues, and the real person on the phone would not figure out that that's an AI he's talking to. I'm pretty sure by now we have that. Yeah, this was 2017. By now we have that. I'm sure about that. But the more interesting part about this experiment was that the programmers, in order to train the AI, they created two AIs. So instead of them talking to the AI all the time, and that would have been very time-consuming and exhausting, they just created another AI to ask. So one AI to ask questions and the other AI to answer them. So they start the experiment by night, they go home, they come back the next day, and these two AIs had developed their own language. Now let that sink in. Now, is that a proof of creativity, that two AIs were able to create their own language? Superficially speaking, maybe. But if you dig a little bit deeper into this, you start to question that. Because if you look at the language, I can, I, everything else, balls have zero to me, to me, to me, to me, it's still English, right? So it's not a completely new language. Yeah? Then on the other hand, what made me a little bit suspicious was that I'm not sure whether the scientists, I certainly can't understand what they're talking about. And if I cannot understand what they're talking about, then who's not saying that this is just pure garbage, that it has no sense whatsoever, that it might be just a glitch in the programming? So there needs to be more research on that. But there's another example of creativity, which I think is more valid, which is the AlphaGo versus Lee et al. Game. If you haven't seen the documentary AlphaGo, I can highly recommend it. Check it out. It's free to watch on YouTube. And what you see here in this image is the famous Move 37. Yeah? Move 37 was a seminal moment in this game. The game was, I think they had 5 games. There was a tournament. Yeah? And they were in the middle of the game, and the AlphaGo, the AI, put a stone somewhere, like you see these 2 black stones almost in the middle of the game. The one to the right is sitting very oddly in the game. And when AlphaGo made that move, the moderators of the game said, that is strange. That's ridiculous. No one would do that. That must be a mistake of the AI. That doesn't work. And you see Lee et al. Really concentrated and trying to figure out what that move means now. After a couple of minutes, the moderator actually said, oh, wait a second. That's actually very creative. And that was very telling for me, that the moderator of the show, without even thinking about it, said that that's really creative, because no human would do that move, but it still won the game for AlphaGo doing that. There's much more to say about this too, but I'm gonna move on here because this is a fascinating story. I can really recommend to you checking it out. I talk a lot about machine hallucinations in other lectures. I have to admit that the languages like machine hallucination, dreaming, and vision are terms that I took over from computer science. So they have been used in computer science a lot in order to describe the behavior of machines, specifically of neural networks. And I remember that the first time I started using this terminology in papers, writing about these problems, I was rejected in the architecture discipline because people were saying, why are you using this esoteric language in your papers? I mean, it's interesting what you're doing, but your language is so esoteric. Until I had to clarify with them that I did not invent it, and I just took it over from computer science, and computer science took that over from neuroscience. And it's a very simple process, actually. We now, with we, I mean humanity, more or less, or at least the science, neuroscience in that area, believe that we understand, to a certain extent, how things like hallucination, dreaming, works in our brain. 1 second, please. Okay. And that, because we know how that works, we can actually take that over and create mathematical formula out of it, which we can apply in a variety of different computational methods. I'm gonna move on this. I'm gonna just jump over these images here, which explain a little bit more in detail how we apply a variety of these techniques, because I would like to come to the conversation with Federico as soon as possible. And let me go to an example in architecture, how we apply that. So we have been commissioned to create something called the robot garden, which we designed using 2D to 3D style transfer. And basically, this is our client. Yeah. So the design was for a test ground for the new building from the University of Michigan for their bipedal robots. And we basically collaborated with Michigan Robotics in developing the code that allows us to train a neural network on hundreds of different satellite images in order to create a variety of different terrain on the site. They need a set of different terrains on the site to test the robots in different conditions, like how do they walk on gravel, how do they walk on rock, how do they walk on sand, how do they walk on grass. And all of that, we used all these images in order to train those features on the site that was given to us by the client. Now, funny enough, not all of the training is successful. Sometimes you get results that are strange, weird, not really that useful. But through training over and over again, we got to something that we could apply. By the way, there is this interesting discussion in computational design now about the fact that this sort of try and error thing. I'll be right back. Sorry for that. So I was saying that the robot garden was done with a variety of different ground conditions for them to test out. Right now we're working on the boulders of the robot garden, which will come into place over winter. So that's the final design here, instruction plans, and let me come to the images, how it looks now. Yes, so this is the current condition. So you see the only thing missing here are basically the boulders that we're going to produce over winter. And then we have something also when we work on plants. I was saying before that we have like this incredible repository of plants throughout history. And that, of course, this can be the base for training a neural network. Understanding, for example, in this case, what are Baroque plants? What's the features and qualities of a Baroque plant? And we were curious on what happens if we start to take modern plants and see how they can be affected by the neural network. So this is a series of them being generated by the GAN. And then ultimately, we came up with something like this. So this is not like a plan for a specific project. That's also not the point here. This is more like trying to understand how to create a proof of concept design for a project. Not even, a project maybe in another sense. It's more like a project in the sense of Peter Eisenman's ideas of how to process a specific idea and thought through a variety of drawings or models. And this could be rather maybe described also as something that Sandra and I have worked on occasionally called an abstract machine, which is a collection or a repository of possibilities and ideas to be used in an upcoming project. And of course, you can do this also in large scale. Finally, I would like to present to you a recent project of ours where we used something called an attention gun as the originator of the design. Attention guns are really interesting because they basically allow you to use language as the starting point for a project. So instead of sitting down and sketching something or collecting images, you basically can speak the program. It's almost like making a magic spell that creates imagery. And the imagery can be then used or was used by us to come to a result in terms of the three-dimensional model. This was for a competition for a school. It's a large school in Shenzhen with about 100,000 square meters, and it was designed for about 3,000 students. And the interesting thing with the attention gun is that normally it's used in a way so that you describe something, and the attention gun will create a highly realistic image of the object. But we intentionally tweak the language almost into a surrealistic way, in order to generate these ideas of estrangement, defamiliarization that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. So there is this ability on the one side to create this incredible coloration and volumetric quality of the design, but at the same time, it reminds you maybe of things that exist. But on the other hand, it adds to this a profoundly different ontological quality that allows you to question the program in a particular way. What we did in the site was, just to give you a couple of more pragmatic decisions we made here with the site. The site has a height difference of 8 meters. So on the highest point, it's about 8 meters height, and on the lowest point, it's almost 0. This site is very, very close to the sea. So the water table is very high. Yeah. And in order to did some pragmatic decisions about, for example, where to position the car parking and so on to avoid going under that water table. And that triggered a lot of different things within the site, like where do you position the running track and football track? Where do you position the highest buildings, where the lowest ones? What we wanted definitely to do was to break up the school into a series of buildings that are distributed on the site and that allowed to create this sort of almost mountaintop village condition. So we were rather looking for a very articulated, vivid quality of architecture instead of making one mega building that could be the school. It was really more about creating this village of knowledge and teaching and learning rather than one gigantic building. And because we actually translated the coloration not only to the buildings, but also to the site, it creates this sort of weird camouflage quality within the site, which I thought was quite interesting. See here in the section, you can see a little bit better where we position the parking garages and so on. And then on top of that, we had the PE center, so physical education center, dormitory, laboratory building, classroom clusters, and so on and so forth. And some gardens around it, multi-purpose hall, which was also used by the community around the school. So there was like oh yes, and we kept the interior of this extremely pragmatic. So there's a current problem when you're using specifically 2D to 3D and 3D style transfers, is that you can easily do an exterior, but it can only do the exterior. It does not have a relationship to the interiority. So you can actually take this as an advantage and completely independently develop the interior from the exterior. So we are, of course, here touching on something that's almost sacrilegious in architecture, which is we intentionally divide interior from exterior condition. So we are barely relating the interior to the exterior. I thought this was an interesting problem, architecturally speaking, where you're really talking about those kind of bags around the building that allow you to have like a very thorough, simple, pragmatic interior versus a highly articulated, complex exterior condition. The breaking up of the volumes also helped a lot in creating something that has a human scale. So you see how the human figures relate to the various broken up building parts. Yeah, so even the larger buildings, like the lab building here, was broken up into smaller volumes that allow you to have a closer relationship to you as the human spectator of this, instead of having like one gigantic building that has only one facade, for example, with repeating windows. Yeah. The classrooms of the laboratory building, there were some laboratories here that were not supposed to have daylight. I think this was some chemistry labs. So that's why you have this sort of deep building. We were assisted by Bollinger Grohmann in developing the structural engineering for this project, which was extremely helpful from them and really made the project very convincing. We were shortlisted for this project and came into the final 5 for the competition. And considering that this was the first attempt where we really created this proof of concept project for ideas on the use of artificial intelligence in architecture, I'm curious to see how we're gonna move on from this point now. And I'm also happy about the fact that it most certainly has a different quality to projects that we've done so far. So artificial intelligence is really starting to influence and describe our projects in an alternative way. And we'll continue working on this within the next projects that we will be working on. As a final part of my lecture, I would like to share with you a couple of animations that were done for the project, so that you can understand maybe a little bit better what I was talking about in terms of the human relationship, the breaking up of the volumes in chunks and pieces that allows you to have a more a scale that really talks to the human figure. And I would have loved to see this school built. I think it would have been an amazing school for the students to visit this, experience these gardens and the landscape that was created not only on the ground, but a landscape that is also present in the verticality of the buildings and the stepping and intersection of volumes and spaces. And with this little animation, I would like to end my lecture for today. And I would like to thank Santiago and Federico and everyone for the fantastic invitation to talk to you guys. And I would say we open up now for questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Matias. It was a very enriching talk, and we open to the questions now. First, I have some of my own, so I'm gonna ask you just a couple of questions, and then I want to talk about the last project. I think I like it pretty much. I think it's a very original way to use this technology in a way to create like different or just kind of novelty in architecture. So I think it's a pretty good way to use it. So it was awesome. I didn't know it, so I saw it the first time. Okay, the first question I have is about the AI in relation to culture. If in some way we think that the human being has been removed in a way from, or just not removed, but not anymore in the top of the pyramid of culture and intelligence. Also, in that context, could we begin to define a new culture and intelligence that is typical to the AI in a way?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly the human is not removed, I would say. There's just additional players now. That's what I would definitely say. And also there's a lot of discussion around that, like how true that statement is, if it's true at all. Because at the end of the day, AIs are also created by humans, no? So it's not that it just emerged somewhere independently of human intellect, right? But definitely what happens here is that through the products that they produce are certainly challenging for us humans in terms of our understanding of artistic production, artistic quality, and so on. Because if you think about it, art very often has the task to provoke a response from humans, right? This can be just admiration because it's beautiful, or it can provoke you because the statement is critical, and so on. Yeah, the abstraction can provoke still people today, which is kind of funny. But I don't think that AI think in these categories, right? They just produce, and it's us humans who read these categories into what they produce. Yeah, so is it just a machine that is able to produce things that provoke us, and that's because that's what makes it interesting to us? Or is it still the human condition that is underlying this information, and that's why it's producing that? Is it genuinely something new that the AI is doing, or is it just showing us a fata morgana of a cultural artifact? So there's like all these beautiful problems that come along with that. And then another thing I discussed with Sandra already a couple of years ago, I thought this is interesting, is whether real cultural production of AIs are actually perceivable by us at all, yeah, for humans. Because they can calculate things in a speed that is beyond our perception. Maybe they're already creating music that we cannot hear, yeah, or images that we cannot see, because they're outside of our field of vision, because they are just enormously fast going back and forward in their systems. It's the same with this language, for example, that I showed you, the language example. Maybe they already developed a language which we just don't understand. We cannot perceive. We don't understand that. Yeah? And because we have no way to perceiving it, we cannot analyze it, or we cannot admire it. If it's good. Who knows what fantastic art they already created, we don't know about it. But that's just pure speculation. Yeah, there's no scientific evidence for that yet, at least.
Yeah, yeah. In the hand of that topic, I think that okay. So yes, it's a very interesting stuff to talk about, because that kind of separation from the culture we know and we are used to see, and we recognize objects, recognize the styles, recognize stuff, and this like kind of separation from that, and these artificial generations that have a different view of the thing we are seeing. I think in a point it's good for the innovation, or for the novelty, and in a way, so something that make us like take us like it doesn't let us sleep at night, because we don't understand it in a way. But in that sense, the definition of novelty in this topic has a very I think a relevant implication in cultural terms. AI has a culture of its own, so outside of our absolute control. So in a way, we are losing control of the machine in a way, not just full control, but some kind of control, because of the results are visually recognized, but have a different rare organization. So the question is, to be more specific, so is AI a new way to overcome the phenomenological stage of the design process, or just part of adding to that phenomenological background?
That's a good question. So, I mean, in terms of phenomenology, I'm a bit suspicious how that really plays into the production methods or ideas around AI. I think we can, of course, analyze in a phenomenological way the results, right? You think that's the thing they create. If this is the thing they create, then we can take the thing and say what the thing is, right? I'm not sure if we can do the same with the process itself. Like, how do I phenomenologically explain the workings of a neural network, right? That becomes a little bit more difficult. It certainly has an ontology, that's for sure. Yeah, so yeah. It definitely, like a process like a neural network, most definitely can talk about the becoming of an object. Like how does it become something? Yeah. And so in that extent, that makes it a little bit easier to analyze the problem. That's why I also rather like to talk about the ontology of something than the phenomenology of it. Because also I think there's like a variety of confusion in terms of what phenomenology actually means. I have to admit that For example, for me, with an Austrian education on phenomenology, when I came here to the States and I started to read about, all these sort of things that Graham Harman and so on talks about, I was like, what is this? What are these guys talking about? Like, I can tell you like 5 names of architects, which you probably all know really well in America, who talk about phenomenology and obviously have no idea. Yeah. But that's fine. That's why I'd rather not talk about it, because it makes me really furious. So
it's okay.
Yeah. So yeah, especially also because phenomenology in German is very different to what people are talking here. Like if you read Heidegger really in German, it's something different than you're reading the translation in English. I think there's a lot of confusion. Yeah. And I'd rather prefer Husserl, by the way, anyways. I'm gonna stop here now because it's like,
okay.
But back to this problem of creativity and creation, and how AIs are involved with that, and whether AIs are sort of an extension of our creativity or if they have their own creativity. I think this is still an ongoing discussion. I don't think we're at the end of this discussion. I think we barely have started to talk about it. I don't think there's a proper theory about AI and architecture, for example. Yeah. That's still all ongoing and soft, but these are situations I really like, yeah, because it's still very pliable. There's no manifestation of what it really means. There's very little work out there that is really pressing forward. We haven't solved a lot of things in terms of designing with AI, like working in 3D, for example, with AI is in itself a really difficult problem, because every time you change a dimension when you're working with AI, the calculation power explodes. So if you go from 2D to 3D, immediately it goes up like crazy, and it's very hard to get anything calculated with that. We've been barely doing like low poly models with that. I feel like 20 years ago when we were doing like the first models in 3D, we're like, oh, look at that, 50 faces, man, that's amazing. Yeah. And now it's the same problem with AI. You have to be really low poly to get something done, but at least we're getting there, and it's probably going to develop quite quickly.
Yes, we always have the problem of computation, the power of computation, and I think it's going to change a lot in the next, okay, let's say 10 years or more. But it's very interesting because the first CAD computer, or the first exploration of machine intelligence with Nicolas Negroponte and MIT or something like that, they were like doing something very specific, very small, and that now we are doing it like in a larger scale. So I think it's really starting. So it's hard to define stuff, define some topics of this, the condition of the artificial intelligence. I have another question about the perception and creativity. This is somehow a typical question about the AI, but I think it's relevant considering that we no longer have the exclusivity of perception. What is the new role of the architect in terms of design process?
Sorry, I was distracted. Design process, what was the question?
Yeah, sorry. Considering that we no longer have the exclusivity of perception, what is the new role of the architect in terms of the design process?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, look, there's certain things that AI can do really good, and there are certain things they can do really bad. Yeah. So there's one thing that we as humans have that AI still cannot do well, which is, for example, to recognize in a mistake an opportunity. Yeah. And that's a thing where this work with AI becomes really interesting, because very often what happens is that you have an AI and they produce something, right? We discussed before, they produce things. They might not even have an understanding of what they're producing, by the way, right? How should they? If they have no input information about what they're doing, they're just producing. But we as humans have this ability to look into these images and say, I can do something with that. That's a weird, interesting plan that came out there, and I think I can do something with it. And AI cannot do that. Yeah. So it's really this possibility to have like an instant muse. Yeah. It starts to throw things at you. And AI is really good in throwing stuff at you. And you, as the architect or creative person, you're the one who recognizes the value in that, what you get out of it. Yeah. Or let's take another case where you train a neural network for optimization. Okay, so you train it to understand like 1 million different structural systems. And you give him a specific shape. And the AI is then designed to develop the structure within that shape that works optimized based on the thousands of cases it looked into. Yeah. And it's going to give you some proposals. Like, here's 50 possible ways to do that. And then, so these are the ones he gives you. And then there's the trash, so to speak, the things that the AI considered not working. Yeah. And you're like, but that one down there in the trash is much better. It's much cooler. I want to work with that. And AI would never do that because they only can differentiate between it works and it doesn't work. There is no in between for them. Yeah. But we as humans have this weird in-between possibility to say, if I combine that working model with that weird model here, I cannot end up with something that is really useful and interesting. So you see that, and that's an ability, I think, that you can translate in almost any creative part of the world that are using AIs. It's the same in painting, it's the same in literature, it's the same in automated songwriting. All of that exists, by the way. I can recommend to students to check out my YouTube channel. I have a couple of lectures in there, which are specifically, for example, one is talking about AI and art. One is talking about AI and music. Yeah, and I hope I will have soon one up about AI and literature. Because all of these areas, there's so much work going on, which is super interesting. But in many cases, exactly that happens that I described before, which is, taking those bits and pieces that the neural networks are making and putting them back together to something that talks about you as an artist too. So it's not an exclusive relationship. Yeah, it's an inclusive relationship.
Yeah, I have a question now here from Santiago, I think. Yes. He's saying, is AI asking for a new representation system? Maybe light processes, maybe perspective munch plans are not enough now.
That's also an excellent question. In terms of representation, I think we have to understand that the majority of things we're doing with neural networks right now, they're all based on old methods of representation. So if, for example, let's say I collected 5,000 Baroque plans, then they're all represented in the usual way we know. Like there's this sort of standard of how a plan has to look like. And because we're using this historic way of representing architecture, we can teach a neural network to understand certain parts of the architecture, right? So we can make it understand what is a Baroque building or what is a Gothic building. I think that at the end of the day, neural networks are machines that are able to operate through big data and excavate out of the big data something that might be useful for you as a designer. Then the step after that is the one that's asking about the representational qualities. Is that now a decision I make as a designer, or how much does the AI actually interfere with that idea of representation? Yeah. Not entirely sure whether AI needs a new method of representation. I'm not even sure if it would come up with a new one. I actually doubt that right now, because it's always the same thing. It's like with this famous axiom from computer programming: garbage in, garbage out. It really depends on what you put in the system, right? That creates the result you want to have. Yeah. And by the way, I'm not looking for results that I just said results I want to have, right? Which I think is wrong. I'm not looking for results I want to have. I'm looking for results that challenge me as a designer, and then continue working on them. I would be curious if AI would really need a novel methodology of representation. I mean, on the contrary, I think that actually older systems of representation are coming back through AI because it relies so much on historic data. What you could do, though, is if you take the time to change every single plan to something that you think has a more appropriate modern representation, it might be the database that produces something new. And also, I think it's almost too early to talk about this problem right now, because we're so early in just understanding how to create the databases, how to label them, how to really operate this whole fantastic machine. Yeah, I think that working through those problems is going to make that question that Santiago had more pressing. Yeah. So the moment we understand actually what the critical problem is in the representational dilemma, that's when things start to change.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a super interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah. In that sense, I was thinking about with that question of Santiago and the last project you show. It was at the beginning, it was really hard to understand it in a way, only with some of the pictures. But then when you start to explain it, it was like it becomes more clear. And I think it's a good question in that sense, because the project is super interesting and super original in a way. I never saw something like that, and I think it's a good way to introduce these technologies, and I think it's a healthy way to use them in a very beginning of these new technologies to start making projects, making architecture, not just images or just.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to do. Okay, just that I don't have any more questions. I don't know if you want to add something to the.
Yeah, I would have loved if any of the attendees has any questions. I think there's still a lot of them online. So if they have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
They can make it in Spanish if they want to, or can raise their hands if you want to speak. So
they can also ask in Spanish. I'm sure I can understand them. And I apologize that this is probably a lecture in English, which is not that easy to understand. So I'm sorry for that. Yeah, yeah, my apologies.
Okay, I have one more question about the biases. I think it's a very interesting topic in the AI. The AI algorithm, not just the algorithms, just and the way of thinking of that part of the process. So I was thinking, which is the relevance of the biases in the production of AI algorithms?
Yeah, there is a lot of relevance there. That's a very important issue. I mean, there's always cultural bias. Like, for example, if you take the artists examples that I showed, like Mario Klingemann and so on, their databases are primarily Western art. So they're all European or American art. So they're not inclusive. They're just very, that's definitely, again, culturally biased, right? It's really going into one specific direction. So one thing that I've been trying to do with my students, for example, when it comes to architecture design, was that you meet a lot of clients, for example, in China, who ask you, can you do a combination between East and West? Yeah. And there have been many attempts to do that, and most of them were really horrendous. Yeah. So what we offered one of our clients was we're gonna make a database of that specific type of architecture that you're looking for, and we're gonna make a Western database, and we're gonna do an Eastern database, and then we're gonna make a neural network start to connect them. Yeah, and these are really cool because the results don't look like anything else. They don't look Eastern, they don't look Western. It's a completely different thing. But because you can prove to the client that we use thousands of images from Chinese architecture, yeah. And if you look closer, you will see them. And they're like, oh yes, you're right. There's a little shape or something that some little weird feature that they will start to recognize. And I bet you in most cases it's just their imagination, not even real. Yeah. But alone the fact that this was an inclusive process where not me as Matias del Campo sat down and started to fantasize about a Western-Eastern architecture combination, but rather scientifically said, here we have one database with 5,320 Western images, one database with 1,520 Chinese photographs. And the neural network is what's doing the combination between the two. So I'm using actually a scientific process to do it. I'm not influencing as a Western architecture result. Yeah. Of course I am, because at the end I'm also doing the weights and all this kind of stuff in the neural network. But it is possible to create something that is outside my scope or my sensibility as Matias del Campo, and rather starts to talk about the problem of bias between these databases, more than about me and my sensibility and my taste and my education. And I think that's incredibly powerful, because you can do this everywhere. Yeah, you can take, 5,000 examples of blend from Argentina, and I bet if you will find something that makes it uniquely Argentinian, yeah, within the database, and then apply that to the problem that we're tasked to design. Yeah. So there's a lot of super interesting things you can do with it. But again, we're very early in the process, and it's so time consuming to do these databases. I spent the whole summer creating just one database, and with labeling and everything. So it's really time consuming. There comes another problem with that, by the way. You can outsource labeling. Yeah, there's something called the Turk. I think it's from Google, I'm not entirely sure, where you can send in your images and you have somebody sitting in India in a cubicle label them for you for very little money. Yeah. But that's also, again, morally very problematic. Yeah. So a lot of things in this computational area are really, really interesting. It's the first time in my career where I had to deal with this sort of moral problems and problems of ethics in designing that I didn't have before. Yeah, because it was just me modeling stuff and it looked cool and that's it, ciao. Yeah. But now when these things are involved, like labeling something, who's doing the labeling? Is it me? Is it a group of people? What happens if a group of people does it? Do I outsource it and pay somebody to do it? But I'm exploiting somebody because I'm paying him shit for that. So, or not me, Google pays them shit. Yeah. I pay Google something and they, take most of it out and then pay somebody really badly to do it. So all these problems of morality, ethics, and so on, they're part of this conversation.
We have one more questions or two, I think. It's from Eric Goldenberg.
Is he here?
Yeah, I think he's asking from Facebook.
All right.
Maybe. So he's asking, why is it still relevant to renounce authorship and its ugliness and an unattended subconscious pursuit through AI?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure if we're talking about ugliness. We're just talking about an aspect of aesthetics that we don't understand 100%. And that's why we call it ugly. Yeah. So it's just a category of aesthetics that is not fully integrated in our community as designers, architects, or something else. Yeah, we just don't understand it yet. And by the way, I sometimes think that things that are considered ugly are interesting for me because they actually challenge us as a cultural animal. Yeah, and we learn something from that. Yeah, I mean, Gothic was considered ugly for hundreds of years. Yeah. Like the whole Baroque era despised Gothic architecture down to the 19th century. That's when they rediscovered it. So these categories are really hard to manifest. Like, how do you manifest here? A beauty ideal of today is not the same as the beauty ideal 100 years ago, and it's not going to be the same like the beauty ideal in 100 years from now. Yeah. So it's really just if you have a certain sensibility, you can work with it if you like. I'm curious about challenging myself as a designer. Yeah? And if some people consider it ugly, I'm fine with it. I have no problem with that whatsoever. So that was the aspect about ugliness. And the other one was?
No, just that was the last one.
Okay, good.
Okay, I think we're good. Thank you very much, Matias. It was very kind of you to have this conversation, and the lecture was pretty awesome. So thank you very much again. Thank you to the people. And one more thing. Okay, I say it already, but the next Monday we're gonna have a Antoine Picon, and I hope we see all the attendees the next Monday. So thank you very much again, and see you soon.
Thanks for having me. Thanks a lot. And thanks for everyone coming to the lecture. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.